Nearly a month ago now, I made a video titled, "We Might Have a VV Problem," to talk about my concerns about VV Ornithir and Agatha's Soul Cauldron in Standard. At the time, we were like 10 days past Standard rotation, and while the early results on the Izzet Cauldron deck were pretty concerning, I said that I really wanted to wait and see what happened at the big Spotlight Series event at the end of the month before passing full judgment on the deck or on the format. Well, this weekend was Spotlight Series Planetary Rotation down in Orlando, and now that the event's in the books, I can confidently say that Standard is super cooked. Do you want an $800 standard deck that's probably about to get banned? Well, you can snag all the cards for that deck from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Before delving into Standard and what went on down at Spotlight Series Orlando, I should say that in this video, I'm not going to rehash everything that we talked about in the first video. So if you want a breakdown on why the Agatha Soul Cauldron VV synergy is so problematic, how VV was designed and some of the issues there, the failings on Wizards' parts, go back and watch that video, because in this video, I really want to focus on what went down this weekend, where we're at now in Standard, and where we could and should be going in the future. From my perspective, there were three big issues to arise from Spotlight Series Orlando, and the first is probably the most obvious one, which is the meta. So at the event, the Izzet Cauldron deck started off day one at 30% of the meta, which honestly was a little bit less than I was fearing. I think having the top deck be 30% of the meta is definitely not good for Standard. That's not a sign of a healthy format, but it's also not as bad as we've seen in the past. Like Pro Tour Final Fantasy, Izzet Cutter was 42% of the meta, and then it obviously got banned, and Wizards even said they would have emergency banned it if they had to. I would say that in Standard, a good Standard format typically has a top deck somewhere in the 20% range, maybe slightly over at the most, like 22, 23%. That's kind of what makes for a good Standard format and a great Standard format, a super diverse Standard format. You might have the top deck be 10, 12, maybe at the most 15% of the meta. So while 30% of the meta is definitely way higher than I want it to be, and I would argue honestly close to the level where you're going to be talking about possibly banning cards from the deck, it's not as bad as it could have been, or we have seen at some other recent events. So you're probably thinking, well, if it was only 30% of the meta, then what's the problem? Why are we even making this video? Well, the answer there is that then day two happened. So the way big Standard tournaments work, in case you don't know, is that they take place over 2 days. And on day one, everybody gets to play. And then on day two, the best performing players from day one get to come back and play again for a chance to make the top 8 and win the championship. So while Izzet Cauldron was only 30% of the day one meta down in Orlando, on day two, it jumped all the way up to 54%, which is an absolutely absurd increase, especially for a deck that was already the most played deck in the format. We occasionally say a deck that's like 4% of the meta on day one, jump up to 8% of the meta on day two, but I can't think of another time where I saw a deck go from 30% of the meta up to 55% of the meta on day two. I'm probably missing one. If you can think of another example, let me know in the comments. But I couldn't come up with another example of such a massive increase for the most played deck off the top of my head. And this was despite the fact that every single player playing in that tournament went into the tournament knowing that Izzet Cauldron was the deck to beat. We saw people playing High Noons in the main deck, for example, these narrow sideboard cards, specifically to try to stop the Cauldron deck. Essentially, Izzet Cauldron and VV had a massive target on their back, and despite the fact that everyone knew that, no one could hit the target. While it was technically Mono Red that actually took down the event.
That's it. That is it. Brennan Roy picking up the victory here in emphatic fashion.
Every number outside of the champion itself shows complete domination by Izzet Cauldron, from 30% of the meta on day one to 54% of the meta on day two. The deck finished off by taking up 6 of the top 8 slots and also 20 of the top 32 slots at the event. Well, the metagame percentage itself, and especially the absurd conversion rate and win rate going into day two, is already a problem. The event also illuminated the big problem with VV Cauldron's miserable play pattern. Just take a look at this board state and that paper trying to be used to divide the board and keep track of what's going on. Does it remind you anything? To me, that looks exactly like a board state that Nadu would generate back in Modern before it got banned, with the paper trying to keep track of what VV creatures you've already activated, which ones you haven't activated. You know when your opponent has to make their own paper and pull out the conveyor belt to go through their 15-minute combo turn? That the format's probably not in a great place. And remember, this is happening in Standard, a format with way less tools and way less degenerate combos than an eternal non-rotating format with 22 years of cards like Modern. Hilariously though, despite the massive metagame percentage, the wild win rate, and the poor play patterns, all of which I find super concerning as an avid Magic player, I'm not actually sure how much Wizards, the one entity in the world that actually has the power to fix this problem, cares about any of this. But a third and much less obvious problem arose at Spotlight Series Orlando, and this is a problem that, at least traditionally, Wizards cares a ton about, and in the past has spurred them into taking some pretty swift and drastic actions, which is no one actually showed up for the event. Now, I don't mean this literally. There were around 700 players who showed up to play in Orlando, which might sound like a pretty decent number. I mean, 700 is a lot of people. But when you consider that the last Standard Spotlight event back in January had around 1,500 people, this is like a 50% decline in a matter of months, which is a super huge deal. Throughout Magic's history, big drops in attendance have often been cited as the reason for bannings. If you look at the Affinity bannings back in Mirrodin Standard, or the Callblade bannings about a decade later. Players simply refusing to play the game is kind of Wizards' nightmare, and traditionally it has led to really swift action. Here, it's important to note that there could be other reasons that at least in part account for the big drop in attendance. It is a holiday weekend. Maybe people got other plans on Labor Day and don't want to go play Magic. It's also back to school time, so maybe people are moving into their college dorms or doing back to school shopping. It's also in Florida, which is a state that some people just don't really want to visit. Still, when you combine the attendance of the Spotlight Series event with players reporting that they won their Standard Store championships by default by being the only person to show up, and local game stores and tournament organizers talking about not being able to fire Standard events even though the other events are firing, and I don't think it's a huge leap to say that, at least in paper, Standard attendance is really struggling right now. And this is especially concerning because we're living in an era where Wizards is actively trying, in their words, to revitalize paper Standard play. When you add all this together, a tier 0 deck with a miserable play pattern and players seemingly voting with their wallets by refusing to show up and play the format, it's pretty clear that we already need more bannings in Standard. And yes, I know we just had a bunch of bannings a couple of months ago. And yes, I know that bannings sucked, and if we lived in a TCG utopia, bannings would never have to happen. But unfortunately, we live in reality, and in reality, Izzet Cauldron is essentially killing the Standard format, at least on a competitive level. A month ago, I made it super clear that I wanted to wait until the Spotlight Series event before passing judgment on the format, and now that we've gotten there, I'm going to make it super clear again. We need to have VV or Egg of the Soul Cauldron, or even both banned in Standard, and the sooner the better. We'll wrap back around to the bannings, and what Wizards should do, and what I think they will do in just a minute. But first, there's something else we need to address. The reason that we're in this position of even talking about bannings again is 100% failures on Wizards' part. Without actually being inside Wizards, it's hard to put your finger on the exact reason for the problem. Are they testing cards enough before they print them? Do they have enough manpower to make the increasing number of sets that they're trying to make, even though Hasbro laid off a bunch of people like a year ago? Is Wizards so focused on printing busted and powerful commander cards that they just don't really care what happens in Standard because it's so much more profitable to be pulling money out of the pockets of casual commander players? Maybe it's all these things and a bunch more. But the actual solution to the problem of bouncing from broken Standard format to broken Standard format, from banning to banning, is for Wizards to stop printing so many cards that are so busted and so broken that they need to be banned. As I mentioned in the original video, we do want Wizards to take some risks when making Magic cards, and we also want Wizards to push some cards and make them powerful, because powerful cards are super fun. But those risks need to be measured and smart. Think of it this way: jumping out of an airplane with a parachute can be super fun. Jumping out of an airplane without a parachute is incredibly foolish and most likely deadly. And jumping out of a plane without a parachute feels like what Wizards has been doing with their design and testing process lately.
This card is like a really exciting Magic card. It lets you do a lot of powerful stuff. It gives you a big dream to go after. Time will tell, if it is too strong, if it should have been like slightly weaker or something. But I think that if you try and just play it safe all the time, do exactly the obvious thing of like a tap ability or a of removing counters or whatever, that's not how you like push the envelope and get people to be like, wow, this card is super exciting. And I think this card is one of the most exciting cards in the set for a lot of people. So like I said, we'll see how it turns out.
Printing a card that randomly combos with some obscure old card and ends up breaking a format is super forgivable. Messing up when you make a brand new mechanic that you've never tried before and going a little bit too far, like with equipment or vehicles, is also super forgivable. But just printing absurdly power crept cards, and in some cases, admitting that you even knew the cards were super risky and just doing it anyway,
like I said, we'll see how it turns out.
Not nearly as forgivable in my book. All this to say, if you're angry about the possibility of another banning, be mad at Wizards for making so many cards that need to be banned, and not at other players for pointing out that something's wrong and needs to change. Of course, this problem is compounded by Wizards' refusal to manage Standard and ban cards in a timely manner. Over 2 years ago now, Wizards announced that they would only ban cards in Standard once a year outside of extreme emergencies, and then about a year after that announced that they were going to minimize the number of ban list updates that happen throughout the year. As a result, where we sit currently is the next scheduled ban list update doesn't happen until the end of November, almost 3 months from now. If Wizards had more frequent ban list updates and were actually willing to use them, then printing cards like Vivi would be at least a little bit less risky. Sure, Vivi would still break the format with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, but if we had a ban list update every month and Wizards would actually use it as necessary, then printing super risky cards like Vivi and Nadu wouldn't be nearly as problematic because, yes, even if they did break the format, it would be a relatively short-term problem rather than one that kills people's interest in playing the game or playing a format for many months on end. Anyway, back to the bannings. I am fully convinced that either Vivi or Agatha Soul Cauldron, or possibly even both, need to be banned out of Standard. Personally, I think that Vivi is the correct card to ban from a gameplay perspective. Agatha Soul Cauldron was in Standard for 2 years and was a perfectly fine and fun card until Vivi came along and kinda destroyed everything. If Vivi gets banned, then I think Agatha Soul Cauldron should go back to being fine again, at least with the current card pool, unless Wizards, print some ridiculous activated ability in some future set while Soul Cauldron is still in Standard. Vivi, on the other hand, I'm not sure if Vivi would be okay without Agatha's Soul Cauldron. It might be, but it also might be that Vivi is still just too powerful in some prowess style shell. And if it is, then we're just going to be repeating this same process. And this is a process that no one wants to be going through. Wizards doesn't like bannings. Players don't like bannings. I don't like having to make constant videos about bannings in just a couple months. So from my perspective, it just seems safer if you're only going to ban one of them to ban Vivi, because I think there's a higher chance that Vivi could still be broken in the future, even without its best friend. And if you want to be super safe, you can just ban both of them, and then it's not going to be a problem. All this said, I expect that Wizards will choose to ban Agatha Soul Cauldron over Vivi for 2 big reasons. The first is that Agatha Soul Cauldron is the older of the 2 cards. Wild's Eldraine, not really selling much anymore. Wizards not making any money on those booster packs, while Final Fantasy is still kind of generating sales and one of the biggest sets ever printed. The other reason is Agatha Soul Cauldron is the in-universe card, and Vivi's the out-of-universe card. And I think if Wizards has to choose between banning a card with their own IP and banning a card from the Final Fantasy set that sold $200 million in a single day and is the biggest set of all time and one of the most iconic characters in the set, I think they're probably going to choose to go after their own IP. Plus, we don't actually even know what their contract is with Square Enix. Like, it is possible that they're afraid to ban an iconic Final Fantasy card because it sends a bad message to their partners. Maybe it makes other people less likely to work with them. Like, I don't know, you're going to do a Spider-Man set if the Spider-Man people are worried that they're just going to ban Spider-Man 2 months after you print it in your premiere format. So all things considered, I think that Soul Cauldron is way more likely to be banned than Vivi given the choice. Although, like I said before, I think that's the riskier of the two choices at a minimum, and probably the worst of the two choices for players. So when will these bannings happen? As far as I'm concerned, the answer should be tomorrow or like next week, sometime in the very near future. And while I think there is some chance that this happens and dropping attendance and gameplay issues essentially forces Wizards' hand to do something they really don't want to do, I think it's more likely that Wizards stays the course and we don't get any bannings until November. As much as we meme on Wizards and they're kind of known for changing course randomly and jumping from here to there and reversing themselves all the time, for some reason with this "we hate banning cards" things, Wizards is super fanatical, like we're never getting rid of the reserve list level fanatical. And that's exactly what needs to change. What I want to come out of all this the most is not actually the banning of Vivi or Agatha Soul Cauldron. I am fully convinced that at least one and maybe both of those cards are going to be banned by November at the latest and hopefully earlier. But what I really want to come out of this is Wizards changing the schedule on how they handle bannings. Wizards simply can't keep printing busted Commander focus cards into Standard and then into Modern, and then refusing to ban them for many months on end. It is killing competitive 60 card Magic. If Wizards feels like they need to wait until November for consistency or messaging, or paradoxically because they think it gives players the confidence to play their game, even though I'd argue the attendance data seems to suggest maybe it's actually not working, WotC, at least for competitive Standard, that announcement needs to contain not only the banning of Vivi or Soul Cauldron, or maybe both, but the announcement that they're going to move to a more frequent and flexible ban list schedule. The kind of schedule that is run by a modern gaming company in the year 2025 and not by some dying toy business from 100 years ago, which seems to be where we're stuck now. Basically, Standard is super cooked. Banning something from Izzet Cauldron will pull it out of the fire for the short term, but actually putting out the fire forever is going to require changes to the testing and the design process, as well as a much more frequent and flexible ban schedule. Otherwise, we're very likely doomed to just keep repeating this process with future sets like Spider-Man Avatar and Lorwyn. And that's why I think Standard is cooked, but what do you think? What should we do? Can we wait till November? How can we fix this problem going forward? Let me know in the comments. Are you looking for even more Magic? Well, check out my deck specifically for beating Izzet Cauldron here, or maybe the video where we talked about the most broken combos in the history of the game.